All right, people are trickling on, so I will do slow introduction. I'm Sarah Hall, the director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. Thanks so much for joining us once again for Let's Talk Art. For those of you who would like a Zoom refresher, this is a webinar format. So although we approach these programs as conversations that have back and forth, you can ask or answer questions in the chat. You can raise your hand. We'll get to you as soon as we're able. You also can adjust your screen view at top right between gallery or speaker view. So the gallery view will show all of us. The speaker view will just show you which one of us is speaking. Tonight, Agnita M. Schreiber, Curator, Daniel Fulco, and I are speaking with David Taft Terry of Morgan State University about the powerful exhibition currently on view at the Museum of the Work of Joseph Holston, Color in Freedom, Journey Along the Underground Railroad. And I will tell you that, we have a visitor's comment book, and people are really, really moved by this exhibition. It's been a real privilege to be able to help catalyze that kind of experience for our visitors. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our funders. The Hagerstown presentation of Joseph Holston, Color in Freedom, Journey Along the Underground Railroad is made possible in part by a grant from the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, a certified heritage area of the Maryland Heritage Authority, and the generosity of Bob and Mary Helen Strauch. The exhibition is on view until January 15th. I think it is a perfect experience to share with your family over the holidays. So please do come and visit us. If you've seen it before, come and see it again. It's a really wonderful experience. So I'm going to turn things over to Daniel Fulco, our Agnita M. Schreiber curator. He's going to give a brief introduction to the exhibition, and then we'll get involved in our conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, David, for joining us tonight. Just to give you a brief introduction to our guest speaker, David Taft Terry. He is Associate Professor of History and Geography at Morgan State University. He is a specialist in African American history, and most recently in 2019, he published the book, The Struggle in the Urban South, Confronting Jim Crow in Baltimore Before the Movement. We are so pleased to have him along tonight, as he's going to join us in our discussion about this amazing series of paintings and very powerful body of work. The exhibition that we are sharing with you tonight is really very important. It had been in the works at the museum over the last several years. We're very happy to see it come to fruition. And Joseph Holston is a good friend, as well as his wife Sharon, of the museum. This is the second exhibition that Joseph has had at Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, the first exhibition being from late 2002 to 2003. And just a little bit about Joe before I talk a bit about the exhibition. And let me just share my screen with you. I do have a PowerPoint. Joseph Holston is known for a body of work that highlights the African American experience through his use of vivid colors, exaggerated and simplified forms, powerful lines, dynamic compositions. With a career that spans more than half a century, Holston expresses himself through a variety of media. Tonight, primarily, you're going to see oil and mixed media paintings on canvas, but he also has worked in silkscreen, collage, and etching, which you'll also see tonight. Holston grew up in a small Black community of Hawkins Lane in what was then the rural area of Chevy Chase, Maryland, before moving in 1960 to Washington, D.C. And there he was accepted into a commercial art program at a place called Chamberlain Vocational High School. From 1964 to 70, Holston worked as a commercial artist and illustrator and trained under portraitist Marcos Blahove. And then in 1971, he studied in Santa Fe, New Mexico with portraitist, landscape and still life painter Richard Vernon Goods. Months later, though, Holston changed his direction, resigning from his Washington job, and then thereafter he began a full-time career in painting. Originally, he was influenced by a variety of sources, including Rembrandt van Rijn in his early figurative works, Joe's early figurative works, and then later he studied the abstract work of artists such as Pablo Picasso and Jacob Lawrence, to name a few. And that's when his style became increasingly abstract, and he began to experiment with and use bold colors and flat shapes. These elements you're going to see tonight as we look at the paintings from the exhibition. His themes are inspired by music, African-American history, and daily life, as well as cultural heritage. Today, Holston's widely acclaimed work is included in many public and private collections, such as the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, our very own Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, the Phillips Collection in Washington, and many others. So this is just a little bit to give you a sense of Joe's training and where he's coming from as we look at his work in more detail tonight. Before I mention some of the key themes, there is a quotation that we have in the Grow Gallery where the exhibition is on view, and I just wanted to read it to you in terms of how the artist conceives of the Color and Freedom series. And I quote, he says, "This art is dedicated to all, slave and free, who lived, struggled, fought, and died to paint the stories of their lives in magnificent colors of freedom." So keep that in mind tonight as we go through. In terms of some of those themes and takeaways that we're going to be discussing tonight, the Color and Freedom series shows that that art has the power to make us empathize, to imagine, and to be creative. And in this instance, the artist has put himself in someone else's shoes, and he's taking us for a journey with him. In this case, from the homeland of Africa to enslavement or bondage, from that to the journey along the Underground Railroad, that is the journey to freedom, and then from there, the path actually to attaining freedom. And he does this through intensely colorful, abstracted forms in these canvases and works on paper. You're also going to see powerful lines, rhythmic compositions, and many other techniques. His art can be used to tell a complex and controversial story. It also shows the courage of these individuals to try to overcome adversity. And throughout the series, one always sees hope. And this is symbolized not only through color, but also light is a really important underlying tenet of the group. It celebrates survival as well. And after looking at this, participants will have an enhanced understanding of the Underground Railroad through visual art. And to some degree, also you will begin to comprehend how Holston's 4 movements, as he terms them, each part of the exhibition is divided into these movements, track the journeys of those who traveled along the Underground Railroad. The first of these movements is the Unknown World. Then we're going to move to Living in Bondage, also subtitled Life on the Plantation. From there, we go to the Journey of Escape. And then finally, we go to the Color in Freedom section. So this is, I hope this gives you a better idea of what we're going to be looking at in more detail. The exhibition is on view through January 14th of next year. And there is an accompanying publication as well by Barbara Stefanich. This was produced when the exhibition first launched in 2008. And it opened at the University of Maryland Global Campus, then University of Maryland University College galleries. And it has traveled to a number of venues, including our museum and previously the United Nations in Geneva as well. So this is really a powerful group of works. And our discussion begins with that first movement of the Unknown World. Now, for each of the paintings that we look at tonight, for most of them, I should say, there are a series of studies in which Joe was working out some of the preliminary ideas. And we begin with this painting called Protection. And as I'm going through, Sarah and David, feel free to jump in. Here with Joe anchors the series beginning in Africa. And this represents a king back in Africa, not a particular country or culture, but more in general. His arms are spread out and he's holding two figures very close to him. He is wearing a crown here. And we have the use of the bright red as well as the earth tones. And it's almost as if he were standing in front of a window in which light is being filtered through it. One of the other things I wanted to point out as we're going through tonight, each work of art was done in 2008. So that's when each piece is from. And when it says mixed media on canvas, I have a couple details later on in the presentation. See these patches of canvas and fabric? It was interesting talking to Joe about this at the opening. He explained that he actually cut these out and applied them to the canvases. And this was to give the work some more tactile dimensionality. So when you're looking at them and you see the mixed media, that's what that means, looking at them a bit closer.
So Daniel, I'm sure that you've been in the galleries with people and heard this, but so many people, you know, when they're in the space and they're looking at these compositions that are sort of, geometrically fractured, they're thinking of stained glass. And so, you know, like here, I feel like we're starting out with a very holy image. It echoes all sorts of Christian imagery here, this sense of protection and the wonderful gold color coming through.
Yes. And so for the artist, the entire story, the journey begins in Africa. And then it progresses forward. Just showing here the study with that finished painting. There's a sense of joy in this, of protection and safety, before some very unfortunate and terrible things happen. And this is really quite a contrast to, as we're coming through here in the first movement, contemplation of despair, which is a very visceral painting and one of the darkest in the series, in which light that represents hope is almost entirely omitted in this one. The first reference to bondage, of course, the shackles here attached to the figure's arm. And look at that spiral. It's as if the sky had turned this crimson red. And we have sort of references to blood here and pain. See that?
So I will get personal here because I'm interested in knowing, David, how you know Joe and his work.
Sure.
You want to share with us?
Yeah, when Daniel first reached out to me about tonight's event, I was really excited because I have not had the opportunity to speak with Joe in probably about a decade since the positions that I held prior to joining Morgan staff. I was in the museum world. And so not only knowing Joe as an artist, but also he and Sharon had opened their house to the organizations I was working with to support us in many ways. And quite literally, it was about the time that he was bringing all of these pieces into being. So knowing that I was a historian, and although I write now largely about the 20th century in past positions, I've done a lot of work with the Underground Railroad and runaway slaves and things of that nature, particularly in Maryland. I enjoyed the conversations that he and I had and how he was interpreting the sort of real weight of the history. Many people, Marylanders, surprisingly don't understand or have not necessarily been exposed to the deep and meaningful intersections that our state has, not only with the institution of slavery, but with the phenomena of the Underground Railroad as an institution, as an era, but the idea of slave flight and running away as a form of resistance specifically. We have sort of passing understandings of individuals like Harriet Tubman or say Frederick Douglass, but they were simply representative examples of quite literally hundreds, if not thousands, who are moving out of the state, moving out of bondage as best they can through their own resources and with the assistance of others. I'm in Southern Maryland. I'm in Prince George's, and you guys are there in Washington County. And I remember having a conversation. It may have been with Joe, or maybe mixing him up with another individual. But the irony of how Marylanders, enslaved and free, their paths sort of crossed. Our most famous, for example, runaway may be Frederick Douglass, but there was a gentleman from Washington County who you very well know, James Pennington, who fled from Hagerstown and moved to New York, and ironically, after a few years there, became a minister. And he ends up being the person who marries Frederick and Anna Murray Douglass when they escape from, just quite coincidentally. There's just so many resources and others ways to get our head around the scope and the weight of how running away represented such an important sort of functional, strategic moment, ways in which Black people resisted slavery, and the ways in which others helped them to resist, but also a very powerful sort of spiritual thing. I think the spirituality is what you really see coming through in Joe's work.
I'll mention we did have a comment in the Q&A about the fact that obviously, although the image evokes as Christian imagery in this sense of stained glass, as I mentioned, obviously the religion in Africa would not have been Christianity. It's more about the way we're looking at things today, and Joe's compositions and choices now. Another question in the chat was, why color in freedom rather than colors in freedom? Only Joe can answer that, although I know that he did tell me when he visited that he had some really important, meaningful studio visits during the process of making these that created a lot of the titles to the works through conversation and discussion. And so color and freedom, I think, came out of those conversations, but why singular than plural? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that I've been asked as the exhibition has been on view is, why are there not details of the figures' faces? And my interpretation is that we might imagine these individuals to have been anyone experiencing this, that it's not tied to a specific person. And therefore we may imagine many different journeys and experiences. That's one of the things that is, I think, running through this.
Sure, and you would be able to talk about this, maybe even better than I can, Daniel, but it is kind of a it's done in art history, right? The French realists, Jean-François Millet, you can't, those are basically anonymous peasants in his work. They stand for everyone. They stand for the heroism of everyday life. And so it is kind of using that similar power of anonymity, that it's easier to imagine yourself in the place of someone who isn't overly typified, overly specified.
Exactly. And also the proximity of the figures to one another. It has a dual meaning. In terms of the fact that these persons are in bondage, but they also try to form collective unity and sense of belonging in the face of adversity. And that certainly comes through in these paintings in which the enslaved are being transported to the Americas. And the shackles come up here. And one of the things to note is, in the original study, we can see their feet. But here in the large mixed media composition, their feet are cut off, and that focuses our attention more on the figures themselves. And what's also very interesting is, after Holston finished the paintings, he created a series of etchings that are variations on a theme of each subject. And I found that to be very interesting, that he went back and he decided to reinterpret those same subjects because they fascinated him so much. So that's kind of the chronology. Study, either an acrylic or pencil, the final canvas, if you will, and then the prints, which, because they're prints, they are a reverse image, they're inverted. So if you see them going in the opposite direction, that's what's going on there.
If I just could, the Holston sort of in the role, if I could be so bold, as historian and interpreting, this history. Those themes are throughout. We'll see them as you move through your slideshow here. This notion of community, a community of the anonymous, if you will, sort of every people. There is an argument that these sorts of tragic eras create community in many ways, and you'll see that sort of as you move through this idea of community as a basis for resilience, and that resilience as a basis for overcoming. These are themes that in this series, in this exhibition, you see him returning to again and again from different perspectives.
I love the use of the word resilience because it's so important, right? Joe, and I feel bad because I think he might be listening and putting words in his mouth. But when we walked through the exhibition, one of the things that struck me the most was that he said, you get to the second movement and the light starts to be more prominent because he needed the light. Like as he was working on the exhibition and dealing with, all of this heavy, sad history, he really needed the light himself. But the idea of resilience and community and finding strength in each other is really a huge part of the power, I think.
It is. And just to mention, in talking with the Holstons, the paintings were amazingly done in the short time span of 6 months, all of this work to meet the deadline for the catalog. So it was really quite a feat. And he had sequestered himself in his studio, as Sharon told us, his wife. And he was working all the time on it, but it was a very emotional experience for him, as he shared. And with these here in the first movement, I wanted to also bring along, this is pictured in the book by Barbara Stefanich, the stowage of the British ship Brooks under the Regulated Slave Act of 1788. And in terms of trying to bring in some historical documentation, connecting it to the paintings, and it's difficult to even imagine the conditions that the enslaved would have been in when looking at these diagrams. It must have just been intolerable. And I think Joe tries to depict that in terms of the representation of the figures here, particularly this one where we have one man who's lying down, one individual. And then it's showing them as if they were bound perhaps below deck. We may imagine that here, perhaps preparing to board the vessel.
So we do have we've got a hand up, and it's Paulette Lee, who is one of our docents, gives fantastic tours of our exhibitions. And Paulette, I'm happy to give you permission to talk if you want to add something.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess all I want to, I would like to add that there will be a tour, a guided free guide tour that I'll be giving this coming Sunday at 2 o'clock of the Holston exhibit. And also, I really am enjoying what you're talking about, and I don't know if Joseph is with us, but I hope so, because I'd like an answer to my question about the title.
Color versus colors. Okay. All right. We'll see.
You.
Thanks, Paulette. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
And one of the things also that, is, as we were discussing, is that this aspect of light, that here in the first movement, particularly the passage, the journey over, the light is so dim. It's there, but it's not at all as bright as it's going to get. Now, once we get to arrival in the unknown, that begins to change a bit. You got the pencil study here on the left, in which we do have some variations to this canvas. You begin to see it here. It's just very dim though. And I'd like to point out here, we have the slave owners with their hats, who are towering above this group of the enslaved over on the left in terms of keying us into, their conception of superiority over these people. But again, look at how they're close together here. Again, that aspect of perseverance in the face of hardship that comes through here. And the way that the light also reflects off of this building here, what looks like it could be a sail as well. And then we still have shackled individuals on the right. So Joe very subtly conveys many messages in these paintings. And then from there, from the arrival, disembarking from the ship, we come to a work called On the Block, which is just beautiful and equally powerful as one of these sellers, one of these slave dealers, sort of nonchalantly points up at two individuals who are, this is almost just like business as usual. And then another guy is sort of looking out at us and he has his elbow bent there. We have again the theme of solidarity below with these three figures, but look at how he elevates the position of this, what looks like a couple. They're almost backlit as if it were theatrical, and that light symbolizing hope in some of the darkest moments of the Color and Freedom series. It's really powerful. These figures, and they're conditioned as if they still rise above this adversity, at least in one way that I view it. I love the contrast of the golden yellow light and then the sort of grays and the blacks down below.
So I'm going to say one thing, and I don't, David, you said you're mostly 20th century history, and so you may not be completely comfortable talking about this, but reading the catalog to this book, being around some of the more contemporary scholars that I've had the privilege to be around, the interpretation I'm hearing now is that, sort of the Underground Railroad I grew up with as a sort of monolithic concept, there was the Underground Railroad. It isn't really the way it's being talked about anymore. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit for the folks who are with us tonight. You must be muted, David.
Yeah, I've had an interest in that topic for a long time. I've done some research and database construction around that. I simply haven't published yet, but I hope to sometime before my career ends. And again, my interest in that topic is what brought me into sort of Joe's orbit all those years ago. But suffice to say, yeah, you're correct. The story of the Underground Railroad that most of us have sort of grown up with, or grew up with rather, was really about a story of, as you said, a monolithic sort of structure whereby people outside of the slaveholding South rescued the enslaved people, right? And many of them, many of the narratives, about sort of passengers as they were coded, secreted in the bottoms of false bottom wagons moving across Western Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York into Canada. All of the action really sort of happens outside of the slaveholding South, ironically. But what Joe's work and the work of scholars who have really been chewing on these things in the last 15 to 20 years have reminded us that as exciting and necessary and certainly dangerous as that original interpretation, if you will, of the Underground Railroad, which largely takes place outside of the South. As interesting as that is, the real sort of story, or the story that sort of cinches the narrative together, is how African Americans not only survived the slavery, but even in the process of flight, how they get out of the South, get off of the plantations, get to the cities, get away from slavery. In the process of this time, we have seen new work, historiographically speaking, receive new interpretation. For example, some of you may be familiar with the new ways that we have come to understand Maryland or Harriet Tubman through the work of scholars and through interpretive exercises that artists have sort of been doing, and even the resources that we have that can help us understand. There was a long known publication from the 19th century, really, that really has come under scrutiny in the last 15 or 20 years or so. An abolitionist working out of Philadelphia named William Still sort of published this collection of runaway narratives. He was a quote unquote trained, not conductor. He was one of the people who received runaways who arrived at his doorstep in Philadelphia, and he chronicled, he cataloged, he kept a journal from those who he received over the course of, I believe, the 1850s. Suffice it to say, people have gone into his work and begun to create databases and to cross-check with runaway slave ads and things like that. And in William Still's work, which is called The Underground Railroad, he documents somewhere close to 800 runaways in about a decade span. Half of them come from Maryland. It's just an amazing sort of exercise that has been undertaken in the last, again, a decade and a half, 20 years. And the fact that so much of this stuff is now accessible, I mean, to be able to look at Joe's work and then go to databases where you can quite literally search runaway ads, you get a real weight, you get a real sense of the weight and the power of the simple undertaking of trying to make oneself free, of trying to break away. And all the considerations that go with that, the idea of, what resources are there, who do you leave, who you not take with you, what does it mean to be free without family, what does it mean to risk newly won freedom as Tubman did, and to return to help family. So there's just so much about the Underground Railroad, as you've noted, that has changed in the last generation or so. So if you enjoy the work of artists like Holston, I would send you looking for literature as well, because it can really give you a fulsome appreciation.
Yes, and that some of those issues are, it was written some time ago, or are explored in the accompanying publication, though that was some time ago by Barbara Stefanich. But certainly there's been much more, there have been advances and new discoveries in the field as we've come down to the present. So that's very interesting. We'll have to look into that more. Some of the themes that Joe explores include the separation of families, as symbolized in these two works, Unbearable Loss. It's a very powerful image of a child being taken away forcibly by a slave owner, almost shown as a monumental figure here. And the child, the boy with his overalls on there, he's trying to struggle to hang on to his mother. I find this one among the really powerful paintings. In addition, the print, which is quite different, in which the light almost seems to burst forth from the child and from the mother, and it really highlight that attention while putting the slave owner in shadows. So that's Joe again reinterpreting the original theme, and it's fascinating to see these differences. And then as we come out of the first movement, we go into Living in Bondage, where it starts with Dawn of Despair. And look at the light there. It's this orangish red, and it's as if the sky were bearing down hard on their backs. And as this group of individuals is toiling away, and the rest of the compositions cast in shadow. There's hope, but at this point, it's still very dim. The quarters is another really interesting one in which we don't see any figures, but we see those dwellings illuminated at night, and these lines coming up from the houses almost as if they were a lasso going to pull the moon down. A beautiful image. It brings to mind, looking back at the time period of a watercolor like this by an unknown artist that's in the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum at Colonial Williamsburg, in terms of trying to reimagine what would have life been like back then.
Mhm.
And then the painting here, Bedtimes, referring to an old Virginia term in which the enslaved had to make the schedule. They had to finish the day's work in time before the end of the day's work to avoid punishment. And here they are working away again. The sky, the light is coming down very heavy on them, but they will persevere. They are working together. Look at how the figures are sort of pushed together. They are unified in their direction towards a common goal. So the symbol of hope, always there despite the hardship.
Mhm.
Then we move into the life at home and domesticity in terms of relationship between enslaved mothers and their children with Madonna and Child, which of course has connections with the traditional art historical representation of the Virgin and Child. And we might imagine this could be any mother and child. And I love the bright light in the background here that illuminates them, and in the rest of the compositions in black and violet and cast in shadow.
Mhm.
And in the catalog by Barbara Stefanich, there is a really beautiful. It's a little too long to read now, but a beautiful, poignant lullaby that is quoted. So I encourage you to get a hold of the book and to read that, because it's really very touching. In terms of the mothers teaching important lessons to their children through songs and beginning in infancy with lullabies. So those kinds of things come to mind in this.
And of course,
Yeah.
music is so important to the whole story, not just the way that Joe has structured the exhibition, but also in terms of the sense of community and communication, as well as community. So the references to music are, just kind of reinforcing that, I think, as we move through the story. And I'm going to just give a shout out here to, the everything looks really spectacular on my screen, seeing the works and talking about them, but the show is stunning. I mean, it is, when we were installing it, I texted some photos to my sister, and she immediately, looking at on her phone from Florida, however many miles away, she said, it's like an opera. She immediately understood the movements, the progress, the narrative, the drama, and people do really respond to it. So if you haven't seen it in person, do come see it in person, because it's really quite an installation.
Yes, and as the artist has mentioned, when he was working on the series, he was listening to classical symphonic music, which he enjoys very much. And that's sort of where this idea of the four movements was born. And it is translated or transposed to the context of painting. So music is definitely importantly underpinning the Color and Freedom series. One of the more difficult subjects explored is this one called Rape, done as an acrylic on canvas, and etching as well. A work that really embodies the sinister, terrifying nature of slavery itself and of the atrocities committed against women.
Mhm.
And you have this figure, again, anonymous, the hat completely hiding his head as he towers over her. And she sort of looks away here. The light has become very dim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's particularly powerful, because we associate and perhaps even allow our minds to contemplate the notion of violence in its many forms that were part of enslavement, but the idea of sexual and sexualized violence as a specific form, and again, returning to the use of anonymity, this time in terms of the perpetrator, just I think for me at least speaks to the gross and widespread vulnerability, not just as we may sort of run to in a cliche, the notion of a slave owner being sexually violent against those he enslaved, but the idea that really any white man, especially, and against Black women, the records, the narratives tell us that it wasn't simply always the owner, that quite literally it could be any man, and they understood the broad violence, their broad vulnerability that their conditions relegated them to. So.
Yes, and we can see the response here of the figure in the etching is somewhat different from the painting, which she's sort of noticed the figure behind her, and then here she's sort of almost turning all the way around.
Mhm.
So there are these really interesting differences among the works. There are other works, though, that explore the other aspects of living on the plantation, including this one called Place of Respite, in which a woman is feeding her chickens in the yard. And the late daylight is just very dimly glowing on her, sort of a pink. And then you can look at the highlights here on the birds in the foreground. It's very beautifully done. And as I was mentioning before, you can see here in this detail how Holston has applied those pieces of canvas and fabric to the surface of the main canvas as a sort of a collage element, if you will, making it a mixed media technique. And another thing that comes through here is that the enslaved had to provide food for themselves, to be able to cook meals, to be able to live. And that aspect of their daily life is referenced in this painting as well. Or Private Plot, in which this man is tilling his own crops, not necessarily those of the plantation owner, but for himself. And here we can see that the light is growing. It's becoming ever more powerful. Those are the mountains, very likely, or trees in the background. So as we're coming towards the end of the second movement, the light is going to become more intense. And you can see how it's become somewhat brighter since the painting Bedtimes from earlier. And then as we come into the third movement, the Journey of Escape, we see this changing in terms of now these individuals leaving the plantation, symbolically referenced by the river here. Look at that amazing reflection of the trees or the mountains and the water, of a literal barrier between the past and their journey forward into the present and then what will become the future. So we have all of these elements working together in each composition. And again, in the details, the mixed media technique that Holston is using. And you can see he uses a combination of smoother brush strokes, but also the thicker and pastel ones as well to build up texture across the surface of the canvases, in which he uses that technique. The journeys were certainly difficult, and there was constantly the threat of the patter rollers or organized patrols of men who went out to look for and capture fugitives. And this one, this subject has three compositions. It has the acrylic study, It has the canvas and then the etching as well. And you can see how Joe has sort of progressed through them in different ways. Here, the figure is wearing what looks like a plaid jacket, but the moon is ever bright. And here, the paddle roller is totally obscured. He's in the shadows, such that the moonlight itself is not reflecting him, but it's providing guidance for escapees. And notice he has a dog and he has a gun with him. But here, the moonlight is brighter and it's shining on the man himself.
So we did have one question in the Q&A about the paddle rollers. I don't know, but it's actually directed at you, David, if you wanted to talk about them a little bit. I know that, you know, the derivation of the name, but that's, I don't know much more.
Yeah, it's a corruption of the word patroller, paddy roller, the notion of bringing that sort of collective memory into an interpretive sort of use for his work. Is, I guess, another strength of Holston's work. You know, perhaps the most infamous in terms of the lore of the patrollers or slave catchers, if you will, would be people like Patty Cannon in the late 17th, early 18th, late 1700s, early 1800s, I believe, was her sort of heyday. First decades there of the antebellum era, especially, where she had a notorious quote unquote gang of people who, you know, quite literally looked for those on the run. The jails of the various municipalities here in Maryland and elsewhere were often filled. Their dockets were filled with people captured to be as being runaways. And as laws evolved to favor individuals who were seeking as opposed to those who were fleeing, or quite frankly, those who were innocent but undocumented in many ways, just led to the explosion of the financial reward that people took from that type of work. And therefore, in Black folklore and in other sort of cultural uses, the idea of the patroller, the paddy roller, sort of looms large in ways that its legacy sort of still are handed down to us. But just the idea, just the aspect of runaway slave history from the perspective of the structures and the mechanisms by which so-called fugitive slaves were pursued and attempted to be reclaimed is a fascinating body of scholarship in and of itself. So,
thanks so much.
Yes, it is indeed fascinating. And Joe tries to reimagine some of these journeys and stories, particularly here. Look at this dog, either real or imagined. It's so large, and it almost appears to pounce on this boy and mother here. Again, with almost stained glass-like effects, such that those memories are fragmented. They're part of a distant past, but he's trying to bring them here to the fore.
And if I could, just there were entire sort of secondary and sort of support adjacent industries. There were, the name escapes me, but there was a famous runaway slave hunting dog breeder in Charles County, where people around the region, certainly within Maryland, would rent the services of this man and his animals because he was so proficient at creating dogs who could specifically hunt runaways. So the idea of the dog as a metaphor, as a sort of particular icon in the imagination as well as in the history of runaways, certainly as Holston has interpreted, is dead on point.
I'm going to say one more thing about the light. We've been talking about the light of hope, but I often in these images, it also feels, like it's radiating from the people as much as it is guiding the people, right? It's an inner light as well as an outer light. And some of them, it's really, you really feel it when you look at it.
Definitely. And, in terms of David, you were talking about the dogs, though, going back to the 1860s here, Thomas Moran, the famous American landscapist connected to Hudson River School, originally from England, did this famous and very interesting painting called Slave Hunt, Dismal Swamp, Virginia. And here you can see those dogs jumping out here, almost about ready to chase these people. And then in the background, in the shadows, are the two patrolmen. And though the conception of this is very different, it connects with Joe's theme, though it's part of the Romantic American landscape style and from the Civil War period. So this is really quite interesting to see how it can connect up to other historical works. And
I'll add another little bit to that. That's a little bit of a tangent here, but we had Tim Berenger from Yale speak about our Thomas Moran maybe a year and a half ago or so. And he showed this image, and then he later used it to connect to the Moran that we have, which is one of my favorite paintings in the collection, but it depicts sugar refineries. And Tim pointed out that even though it was an 1880 image of sugar refineries, the sugar being refined would have come from slaveholding areas. And so there's still a message that might have been received at the time that we don't get unless we have Tim Berenger telling us. And he then connected to Kara Walker's domino sugar installation, her giant sugar sphinx that she did, the contemporary artist. So that was a really great talk, sort of weaving together the fact that we don't always see things the way they might have been seen in their own time.
Yeah, as many people know, it's Napoleonic France's loss of its sugar engine, the island nation we now call Haiti, that is quite arguably the sole reason that we have the middle third of the United States. As when he lost Haiti, he said to hell with the rest of it and sold it to the United States government in 1803.
Very interesting. Yes, the Thomas Moran painting has an inscription on the back that mentions the patron who originally commissioned it, and he was a British abolitionist. So there's a very interesting connection here with Thomas Moran in terms of creating a work that speaks to his viewpoint on slavery. He was also influenced by the famous English painter J.M.W. Turner, who famously painted the slave ship earlier. So Moran was influenced by that in terms of creating a work that spoke about the horrors of slavery itself. So just to sort of add that in here in terms of the issues.
I was going to say, it's interesting seeing those images side by side, though, because you get sort of more wrapped up in the landscape of the Moran, right? Which is threatening, consuming, and dwarfing, but you feel the person a bit more in the Holston.
Yes, you do. Moran is like many of the other landscapists at the time. He's given over the composition to the forest and all of its sort of glory here. Whereas with Joe, he's bringing us up close and personal to these people, almost about to be pounced on by a dog. So it's a very different approach. Property loss is another very visceral and powerful image. That these men only see these people as assets. If it's lost money, and it's really very dehumanizing. But again, as you had mentioned, Sarah, the light seems to almost come from the back of this man who's been hanged. Yeah. Again, sort of, even though the light of hope is dim, it's still there. It's still coming through. And it bears some similarities to On the Block that we saw before, too.
If I could, Daniel, and certainly you are the art historian, I'm more of a social historian, but the two figures on the left seem to be hanging their head in shame, whereas the one in the
they're hanging in a different way, yeah.
They're hanging in shame because the one in the overall seems accusatory, and I think that, if I, not knowing for certain, not having spoken with Joe obviously about this, but that was the crime insofar as the court systems were considered. It wasn't murder, they had destroyed another man's property when they killed that enslaved man.
Yes, that's a very good and interesting interpretation, David, of this image. And look at how the figures are huddled and crowded together. I mean, almost shoulder to shoulder here.
Yeah, I almost wonder if the difference in clothing between the three figures with the hat is meant to suggest owner versus overseers. You know, people, in other words, the two on the left working for the single man in the overalls on the right, and in their attempt to discipline or otherwise exert their power, if you will, as overseers, as white men over this enslaved person. They believe it necessitated killing him. But again, it was not murder. It was the destruction of property for which they have to answer to their boss. Again, that's just me off the cuff. But
that reminded me, David, of the essay you wrote for our Joshua Johnson catalog, and the fact that Joshua Johnson's father was a laborer and his mother was enslaved. And this sort of, that was early enough that the relationships between the races weren't quite as extreme, I guess, as this period in history. But yeah, there's always these sort of strata of people, hierarchy.
Indeed. And then the concept that we were looking at with the Moran and also Holston's work, Promising Portal, this is a very beautiful image. Again, almost kaleidoscopic stained glass type approach to the application of colors. See, you can see the sky up above, almost a dusk sky. Look at the blues. And then we can see through a clearing in the forest, but it's as if the foliage is wound together. But it points to the sort of duality of the woods as being a place where one might hide and seek refuge, but also a place of constant danger if one were being pursued. So there's that sort of dichotomy that's going on there, at least in terms of how I read this one.
There's a lot of those lines are very rope-like, right? Too, they feel very entrapping.
They do. And then I paired the House of Refuge as if perhaps this group of figures, fugitives, has stopped for the night. They have a fire, very dim, and the moonlight is anchoring the composition, as are the figures, who are symbolic of unity. And around them are what look like mountains or trees. So it's a rest along their journey. And they're illuminated by that light. Very bright and powerful.
So I'm going to give, we got on a few minutes late, but we're getting close to an hour. So I think we should pick up our pace a little and make sure we hear everything that we can from David while we've got him.
Sure. You were talking before, David, in terms about the traditional narratives, and some of those do come into play here, like In Plain Sight, where the coachman is Black, and then the fugitive, or perhaps both, but the fugitive is disguised as a white person.
Yeah.
At least in terms of how this has been interpreted.
Yeah, there are lots of so what we traditionally think of as abolitionists speak to a body of literary offerings, if you will, or at least in terms of abolitionist literature, from principally the 1840s and 1850s. And these were people who wrote about their experiences, either witnessing or serving as allies. Largely, these were people who were not enslaved, generally not even African American, but who participated in, assisted, witnessed these sort of struggles for freedom as they move in and out of the South, as these enslaved people move in and out of the South, and not knowing with certainty the idea of African Americans of fair complexions, so-called passing for white, often in the company of someone of a darker skin color, presenting themselves as owner and enslaved person, if you will. That scenario repeats itself over and over again in a lot of the literature, a lot of the stories that we have. So you can see in these works Holston really pulling from the historical resources as he's sort of reimagining and presenting these interpretations of this incredible period in our history. Again, the Underground Railroad not simply being about just the movement of people out of the South, but how and with what resources and what harrowing challenges they face, what incredible human heroism they sort of displayed, as well as those who were assisting them. And I think I've said it a few times this evening, so please forgive me, but it is the sort of powerful thing that often strikes me about this time period, and Holston sort of brings it forward, this notion of community, of people committing themselves to the benefit of their sisters and their brothers, their others. You know, we see it in Douglas's Runaway, where people who, at the risk of their own freedom, are helping him to get away. We certainly see it with famous sort of figures like Harriet Tubman, who does all she can to help largely her family and her kin, but also perfect strangers, and just the repeated way in which they place themselves in physical peril, and certainly in terms of their legal status, risking being imprisoned or sold back into slavery themselves over and over, simply to help someone else be free. It's just a powerful, powerful consideration.
Indeed, and as we've discussed Harriet Tubman here, she is underpinning this one as we approach the end of the third movement. And the light, as you can see, the sunlight is growing brighter. One figure here, two figures actually are looking up at the sun as a beacon in terms of guiding them on their journey. And the light, as we continue, will become more intense, especially as we pull into Color and Freedom, the fourth movement. Dawn of Hope, the figures have stopped to take another rest. They're not quite there yet on their long trek, but they're getting there.
So I will interrupt it at this moment and say that, you know, as we've been talking, and I've been thinking about Paulette's color versus colors, for me, if I hazard an answer to that, you know, it's because color is a metaphor and colors are pigments.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you can have multiple colors as metaphors, but, you know, in the title of the show, it works on so many levels. You know, the color of our lives as we achieve autonomy and have choices, the jubilant colors and the way he uses color on canvas, the color of skin. I mean, it works on so many more levels if you are less specific. But if you say colors, I think you start actually thinking about colors. That's my take on it.
I agree, Sarah. I think that color, you know, it has the multiple interpretations. They're leaving it open to us, you know, in terms of how we see it. So yes, that's very interesting. And here in the fourth movement, Color and Freedom, we come to Freedom Realized, where the sun here is really bright. These people have attained freedom, and we see the sort of symbols of intimacy, and in some cases has been interpreted of reuniting of individuals, beginning new lives, a host of different issues. They're getting ready, these figures, to step into freedom as we come into the fourth movement. The study
a really nice comment in the Q&A from one of our regular museum visitors and an artist himself. Jim says, Joe tells a powerful storyline with few words. It is the power of simplicity that shouts out truth. It is the absence of bells and whistles in his paintings that I feel is his great strength. So that's really nicely said.
Very nice. Thank you, Jim. You'd mentioned also the word, the jubilation, the excitement. That also is an undercurrent in the fourth movement. Is once freedom is attained, there is a sort of ecstasy, and it can no longer be contained. It explodes in these colors and in the gestures and the movements of figures. Basically, in many ways, the fourth movement is about the responses of particular people to having attained freedom. Some may rejoice in song, some in dance, and then some in quiet contemplation, like in magnificent melody. This is a really beautiful one where this man is stopped to rest, but he's playing what looks like a flute or a recorder. And those sounds and his thoughts are reflected by this spiral that almost comes up into a cloud here in the upper left. And I love how Joe does that. So graceful. Or Rhythm of Renewal, where the colors themselves are activated and almost correspond to emotions. When we, in art history, one of the concepts we talk about is synesthesia, or sort of the correspondence of different senses of looking, of hearing, and trying to pull those together. And I do see that working in these paintings in the fourth movement, particularly Righteous Rejoicing, but also Sun Warms the Freeman, where the group of people is huddled and pulled together, fully unified with the sun up above here. It's a really beautiful composition. Or Righteous Rejoicing, where the emotions, again, they can no longer be contained. They explode up into this sun with oranges, the reds, and the violets. They're pushing up into the sky. We might picture a chorus singing together. And I think these are the kinds of activities that Holston is trying to conjure up here.
I want to just so that people who are on know this, they might have missed. There are some resources in the chat that David has provided for us if you want to pursue some of these topics further. We have a pretty nice reading area in the exhibition, so you can come in and take a look through some books also. And spend some time in the exhibition. Again, I think that the installation is so cohesive. It creates such an environment of its own. And the reading area is in the final movement, so it is in the happier section, so you can sit and spend some time there. It's really nice. I love a good museum reading area.
It looks like we have a comment from Paulette. She points out a brilliant movement, yes, an emotion evoked without facial expressions. Again, that we were talking about the anonymity, also the bodily shapes.
Yeah, the use of what appears, at least to me, as a sunrise, because a lot of the literature and the recollection, the folk culture, if you will, the end of slavery is often referred to as the end of the long night. So the idea,
It's a new day. Yeah.
Yes, when I was writing about the etching, what also came to mind, I didn't have a chance to ask Joe about it, is the Aaron Douglas, the famous Harlem Renaissance artist, when he did his Congo painting for a mural series, the etching reminded me in many ways. I don't know if it actually influenced the artist, but there are parallels between, I think, Douglas, and in terms of the light and the shadow, almost as if it were on a stage. In Joe's rendition here of Righteous Rejoicing. So sort of looking for different parallels with other precedents. And in terms of abstraction and color, we might also see some ties to artists like Kandinsky or Stanton MacDonald Wright in terms of the synesthesia and color theory corresponding to emotions. So
there's actually, in the reading area, there is a small book on that. So if that's what interests someone, they can get into the sensory connections.
And then the series concludes with the responsibility of freedom, where, this is the culmination of everything that occurred in the journey. But as the artist says, with that comes also what comes next, that it's not over. We continue in our work and in what we have achieved, and we continue to move forward. So we can interpret this painting and the title in many different ways.
So I guess it's a good time to find out if there are any last questions or comments before we wrap up. Feels very ordinary to say that after after kind of going on a journey ourselves. doesn't seem like anyone's chiming in. I did have one little commercial I wanted to say at the end here, which is that we have, if you have any young people in your life, we have a class in January, January 7th, 11 a.m. That is for 1st through 6th graders, and it is called Painting a Symphony. So it's taking the exhibition and the idea of music and composition to do a class with kids. So we'll see what they create on January 7th. But if you know anyone who might enjoy that class, sign them up for sure. And if you enjoy our programs, if you like streaming art related videos, check out our YouTube channel, because all our Let's Talk Arts live there and are part of a healthy library of digital offerings. So it was really a great discussion tonight. It makes me wish that I could, yeah, I can't, the show is still up. I was gonna say, maybe I'll take some of those books from the reading area back to my house over the holidays, but I'll have to wait till the show closes. But it was a really nice conversation. Thanks so much, David, for bringing your experience to us.
My pleasure.
Thank you, David. It was very interesting.
It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, we did have a really nice comment. This is fabulous. It gives me an opportunity to see the exhibit. Your explanations, descriptions, and comments are enlightening and educational. Thanks. I love Joe Holston's art. I've experienced his exhibitions over the years that he's had in his home and his studio. So that's great. We like to keep, we're continuing to do online programming, a couple things a month usually, because we know that there are people who can't always drive to the museum. It also lets us get people like David to help us out, because they can't always drive to the museum either.
Not on a day like this, that's for sure.
It's true. It's a good night to stay in and enjoy some art. So thanks everybody for being with us.
Absolutely. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.